Chapter 1. The train whistle's shriek pierced the Colorado morning, but Clara Mae Henderson felt only the vibration through the wooden bench beneath her. She pressed her gloved hands against her skirts, smoothing the deep blue fabric she'd sewn herself, the finest dress she owned, made special for this day. Through the smudged window, the town of Willowbrook spread before her like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved. Her reflection stared back from the glass, pale skin, dark hair pinned severely back, and eyes that held too much wariness for 24 years. She touched her throat reflexively, where the high collar of her dress concealed the thin white scar that marked where fever had nearly claimed her life 12 years ago. The same fever that had stolen her hearing and her brother's breath forever. "You're damaged goods, Clara May," her aunt's voice echoed in her memory sharp as winter wind. "No man wants a wife who can't hear him call her name." The train lurched to a stop and Clara's stomach dropped with it. Somewhere on that platform waited Thomas Garrett, the man who'd answered her carefully worded letter about seeking a quiet, devout wife for his ranch. She'd been honest about her limitations mostly. The word deaf had felt too harsh, too final on paper. Hard of hearing sounded softer, more hopeful. Surely once he saw her character, her willingness to work her devotion. The conductor's mouth moved and she caught enough of his gesture to understand last stop. Time to step into her new life, or whatever remained of the old one. 3 weeks earlier, Millfield, Ohio. "You cannot stay here any longer." Aunt Cordelia's thin lips barely moved as she spoke, her pale eyes cold as January frost. "I've done my Christian duty by you these past 10 years, but I won't house a spinster indefinitely." Clara sat at the kitchen table mending one of her aunt's petticoats by lamplight, her needle moving in steady practiced strokes. She'd learned to read lips by necessity, though her aunt's disapproval needed no translation. It lived in every line of her pinched face, every sharp gesture of her bony hands. "The widow Morrison needs help with her children," Clara wrote on the slate she kept beside her sewing basket, then turned it toward her aunt. "Charity work." Cordelia sniffed. "That woman can barely feed her own brood, let alone pay a proper wage." "No, Clara May, you need a husband. It's past time you made yourself useful to a man instead of being a burden to me." The word burden hit like a slap. Clara had heard it countless times since the fever took her hearing, always accompanied by that particular tone that made it clear she was something to be endured rather than loved. She set down her needle with careful precision, fighting the familiar shame that rose in her throat like bile. "I've placed an advertisement." Cordelia continued, producing a folded newspaper from her apron pocket. "Mail-order brides are common out west, where men are less particular about defects. I've already received 3 responses." Clara's hands trembled as she read the advertisement her aunt had placed without permission. "Quiet, hard-working young woman seeks marriage with respectable man. Good cook seamstress, devoted Christian. Willing to relocate. Age 24. Apply to C. Morrison, Millfield, Ohio." "Thomas Garrett from Colorado seems most promising," Cordelia said, spreading the letter on the table. "He wants a quiet wife for his cattle ranch, says he values hard work over idle chatter. Perfect for someone with your limitations." Clara read Thomas's letter 3 times, searching for warmth between the formal lines. He wrote of needing a helpmate, someone to manage his household while he worked the land. Nothing about love or companionship, but then again, what else could she expect? At least he hadn't mentioned children. A mercy, since she'd always feared passing her affliction to innocent babes. "The train fare is expensive," she wrote on her slate. "I'll advance it against your father's Bible," Cordelia replied curtly. "It's the only thing of value that he left behind, and I've made it. High time it served some purpose." That night, Clara held her father's worn leather Bible in her lap, running her fingers over the pages where his handwriting filled the margins. Notes from sermons, verses that had brought him comfort, her mother's pressed flowers still fragrant between the pages of Psalms. He'd been a gentle man, her father who'd never once made her feel broken for being different. After the fever, he'd learned to write her little notes, funny observations about his parishioners, or encouragement about her sewing. When diphtheria took both her parents 2 years later, those written conversations became her most treasured possessions. Now even that would be sold to buy her passage to a stranger. She wrote her reply to Thomas Garrett by candlelight, crafting each word carefully. "Dear Mr. Garrett, I am grateful for your interest in correspondence. I am indeed quiet by nature and find joy in domestic duties. I lost my parents some years ago and have been managing my aunt's household since. I am experienced in cooking, sewing, gardening, and basic medical care, learned from assisting my father in his pastoral visits. I hope to be a helpmate worthy of your respect and partnership. If you find my qualifications suitable, I would be honored to travel to Colorado at your convenience. Most respectfully, Clara May Henderson. She sealed the letter before dawn, walking 3 miles to the postal office to mail it herself. Whatever lay ahead in Colorado had to be better than the slow suffocation of living as Cordelia's unwanted charity case. Thomas's reply came faster than expected, brief and businesslike. Miss Henderson, your letter shows proper sentiment. Can arrange marriage by September 15th. Train fare will be provided upon agreement. Send confirmation and travel details. T. Garrett. No poetry, no sweet words, but Clara hadn't expected them. This was a business arrangement, a practical solution to mutual need. She could manage a house, tend to garden men, clothes, and cook hearty meals. Surely that would be enough. The morning she left Millfield, Cordelia stood stiff-backed in the doorway, not even bothering to wave farewell. Remember, she called as the hired wagon pulled away. You're getting more than you deserve. Don't give him cause to regret his charity. Clara watched her childhood home disappear around the bend, taking with it everything familiar. In her carpet bag, she carried 3 dresses, her sewing kit, her mother's recipe book, and a small bundle of her father's letters tied with ribbon. Everything that remained of Clara May Henderson fit in a space smaller than her aunt's wardrobe. The train journey west took 4 days each mile, carrying her further from everything she'd known and closer to a future that felt as vast and uncertain as the prairie stretching endlessly outside her window. She spent the hours watching the landscape change, noting the way settlements grew smaller and farther apart, the way the very air seemed bigger, somehow less confined by the close-built towns of Ohio. Other passengers occasionally tried to engage her in conversation, but she'd learned to keep her responses brief and noncommittal. Too many people became uncomfortable once they realized she couldn't hear them properly, their faces shifting from friendliness to pity or irritation. Better to seem merely shy than invite that particular brand of rejection. Now stepping onto the wooden platform of Willowbrook, with her single bag in hand, Clara felt the weight of every mile she'd traveled. The mountain air bit sharp and clean against her face, carrying scents of pine and dust and something indefinably wild. This was frontier country where people came to start over, to become something new. She spotted Thomas Garrett immediately. He was the only man on the platform, wearing a suit, checking a pocket watch, with the air of someone accustomed to punctuality. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with brown hair and a weathered face that spoke of hard work outdoors. Not handsome, but not unpleasant either. Solid, reliable. Their eyes met across the platform, and Clara felt that familiar flutter of nervousness mixed with hope. She smoothed her skirts one final time and walked toward her future husband, offering what she hoped was a confident smile. Garrett, she spoke carefully, watching his face for confirmation. His nod was curt, businesslike. Miss Henderson. His eyes swept over her from head to toe, cataloging her appearance like he might assess livestock. You're smaller than I expected. Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. She'd always been petite, but she made up for it in determination and capability. I assure you I'm quite strong, she said, then worried her voice had been too loud. Without being able to hear herself, she never knew if she was speaking at the right volume. Thomas frowned slightly, and Clara's heart sank. Already something was wrong, though she couldn't tell what. He gestured toward the main street, and she fell into step beside him, acutely aware of the curious stares from other townspeople. Word of the arriving mail-order bride had clearly spread. The preacher's waiting, Thomas said, his words clipped. Figured we'd get the ceremony done quick. Then head out to the ranch. Clara nodded, though something cold was settling in her stomach. This wasn't how she'd imagined her wedding day, rushed and impersonal, more business transaction than sacred ceremony. But then again, what had she expected? Romance belonged in novels, not in arrangements between strangers. They stopped in front of a small, white church, its bell tower reaching toward the endless blue sky. Thomas hesitated at the bottom of the steps, his jaw working like he was chewing over difficult words. Miss Henderson, he said finally, I need to ask you something direct-like. Clara's mouth went dry. Of course. Are you simple-minded? The question hit her like a physical blow. I beg your pardon. In your letters, you seemed, well, you wrote fine, but just now, when I was talking to you, he shook his head, frustration clear in his expression. You don't respond right. You keep staring at my mouth instead of my eyes. And when that child was crying behind us just now, you didn't even turn around. Understanding crashed over Clara like ice water. He thought she was mentally deficient because she couldn't hear, because she read lips, because she hadn't heard the crying child. Mr. Garrett, she said carefully, I'm not simple-minded, I'm deaf. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, realization, and finally something that looked disturbingly like disgust. Deaf, he repeated, as if the word tasted foul. You mean you can't hear nothing at all? I lost my hearing to scarlet fever when I was 12, Clara said, lifting her chin despite the shame burning through her chest. But I assure you it doesn't affect my ability to. Jesus Christ. Thomas stepped back like she'd announced she had plague. You didn't think to mention this in your letters. I said I was quiet by nature. Quiet ain't the same as deaf. His voice rose and Clara could see people gathering on the church steps drawn by the commotion. A man has a right to know if his wife's got defects. That word again, defects. Clara felt something vital crumble inside her chest. I can manage a household perfectly well, she said, hating how her voice trembled. My hearing doesn't affect my ability to cook or clean or… What about children? Thomas's eyes were hard now, calculating. How you going to hear a baby crying in the night? How you going to teach them proper if you can't even hear them speak? Each question was a dagger striking at every fear Clara had carried for 12 years. She opened her mouth to respond to defend herself, but Thomas was already shaking his head. This ain't gonna work, he said flatly. I asked for a wife, not a… He caught himself before saying whatever cruel word had risen to his lips, but Clara saw it in his eyes anyway. I can't marry damaged goods. I got a reputation in this town. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of humiliation through Clara's entire being. Around them, the gathered crowd murmured and whispered, some faces showing pity, others curiosity, a few displaying the kind of cruel satisfaction people took in witnessing someone else's downfall. I'm sorry you made the trip for nothing. Thomas continued, his tone suggesting he was anything but sorry. I'll pay your train fare back to Ohio, but I can't. This just ain't what I bargained for. He turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone on the church steps with her carpet bag and the weight of absolute rejection pressing down on her shoulders. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whisperers following them like autumn leaves caught in an unforgiving wind. Clara stood frozen for a long moment, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She'd traveled 2,000 miles, given up everything she'd ever known, and been discarded in less than 10 minutes because of something she couldn't control, couldn't change, couldn't fix. The late afternoon sun slanted across the dusty street, and somewhere in the distance, she could see Thomas Garrett disappearing around a corner, already moving on with his life, as if she'd never existed at all. For the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, Clara May Henderson was truly alone. Chapter 2. 3 months later, Clara had learned that rejection could become as routine as morning coffee. She'd been turned down by the banker's son. A wife should be ornamental as well as useful. The widowed shopkeeper. My customers need to feel comfortable. And even old Henrik, the blacksmith. A man needs a woman who can holler when the barn's on fire. Each dismissal stung a little less than Thomas Garrett's public humiliation, but they accumulated like stones in her chest until breathing felt like a deliberate act. Mrs. O'Brien, the Irish boarding house keeper, had taken pity on her that first terrible night, offering a bed in exchange for sewing work. You've got a gift with needle and thread, she'd said in her thick brogue, holding up a mended tablecloth that looked better than new. That's worth something in a town full of bachelors who can't darn their own socks. So Clara had carved out a small existence in Willowbrook's shadows, taking in mending and alterations, sleeping in the church basement on a cot Pastor Williams had quietly provided. She'd saved every penny Thomas Garrett had given her for return passage, but as weeks turned to months, Ohio felt more like a grave she'd already climbed out of than a home to return to. The cattle stampede started like thunder on a clear day. Clara was hanging laundry behind the church when the ground began to vibrate beneath her feet. She looked up to see a wall of dust rolling toward town, and within it, the wild eyes and churning hooves of at least 200 head of cattle. Men on horseback galloped alongside the herd, shouting commands she couldn't hear, but whose desperation she could read in every line of their bodies. The cattle crashed through the main street like a brown river bursting its banks. Clara watched in horror as they trampled Mrs. Garcia's vegetable garden, shattered the windows of the mercantile, and sent people scrambling for doorways and rooftops. When the dust finally settled, half the town lay in chaos. Dr. Sarah Mitchell appeared as if summoned, her black bag in hand and her graying hair escaping its pins. She was the only female doctor Clara had ever seen, a woman who'd earned her place through sheer competence in a world that questioned her right to practice medicine. She took one look at the injured townspeople scattered about and pointed directly at Clara. "You," she called. "I need help. Can you follow instructions?" Clara nodded, rushing to the doctor's side. Dr. Mitchell's hands moved quickly as she spoke, her lips clear and easy to read. "Hold pressure here while I set this bone. Don't let go no matter what." For the next 4 hours, Clara found herself in the middle of the organized chaos. She held wounds closed while Dr. Mitchell fetched supplies without being asked twice, and somehow anticipated what was needed before the doctor requested it. Her hands stayed steady even when young Billy Carson's broken arm required setting, even when Mrs. Patterson's head wound bled through 3 bandages. "Where did you learn this?" Dr. Mitchell asked during a brief lull, genuine curiosity in her gray eyes. "My father was a minister," Clara wrote quickly on a piece of paper. "I helped him tend to parishioners when they were sick or hurt." "Your handwriting is remarkably clear," the doctor observed, "and your instincts are excellent. Have you considered formal nursing training?" Before Clara could respond, another commotion arose near the saloon. A man was down, clutching his leg and surrounded by concerned onlookers. Dr. Mitchell grabbed her bag, but Clara was already moving toward the injured man, her attention caught by something the others had missed. The man on the ground wasn't watching Dr. Mitchell's approach or responding to the voices around him. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Clara's face, reading her movements with the same focused intensity she used to read lips. When she knelt beside him, he didn't flinch at her touch or try to speak. Instead, he raised his hands and began to move them in deliberate, graceful patterns. Sign language. Clara's breath caught. She'd seen it once before, years ago, when a deaf family had visited her father's church. She'd been fascinated by the way they could have entire conversations without sound, their hands dancing through the air like birds in flight. She tried to learn a few signs, and then, though Aunt Cordelia had quickly put a stop to such unseemly displays. The man's hands moved again, and this time Clara caught the meaning. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, then hesitantly signed back. "You are bleeding." His eyes widened with something like wonder. "You sign." A little, she admitted, her movements clumsy compared to his fluid grace. Dr. Mitchell arrived breathless beside them. "How bad is it, Ethan?" "Just a gash," he replied aloud, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned to speak without hearing himself. "Caught it on a broken plank when I dove for cover." "Ethan Cross," Dr. Mitchell said to Clara. "Meet our town's most successful cattle rancher. Ethan, this is Clara Henderson. She's been invaluable today." Ethan's gaze returned to Clara with renewed interest. His hair was dark brown with threads of early silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered lines of a man who spent his days outdoors. But it was his eyes that held her attention, intelligent, kind, and completely focused on her face in a way that felt like recognition rather than scrutiny. "Thank you for helping," had signed it as Dr. Mitchell cleaned his wound. "It was nothing," Clara replied, though her heart was beating strangely fast. "Actually," Dr. Mitchell interjected, having followed their signed conversation with obvious surprise, "it was considerably more than nothing. Clara, you've shown remarkable skill today. If you are looking for more permanent work, I could use an assistant." Clara stared at the doctor, certain she'd misunderstood. "You would hire me?" "I'd be a fool not to. You're observant, steady under pressure, and clearly intelligent. The fact that you can communicate with patients like Ethan here is an additional asset." She tied off the bandage around Ethan's leg with practiced efficiency. "Think about it. As Dr. Mitchell moved on to check other patients, Ethan remained seated on the wooden sidewalk, his attention still fixed on Clara. "How long have you been in Willowbrook?" he asked. 3 months, she signed back, then added hesitantly, "I came to marry Thomas Garrett." Understanding flickered across Ethan's features, followed by something that looked like anger. Thomas Garrett is a fool. The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, hit Clara like a physical warmth spreading through her chest. When was the last time someone had defended her instead of pitying her? You don't know me. She signed testing. I know enough, he replied. I know you stayed to help when you could have run. I know you didn't hesitate to touch blood and broken bones. I know you learned sign language, even though you didn't have to. His hands paused, then continued with deliberate emphasis. I know Thomas Garrett looked at you and saw only what you lack instead of what you offer. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. Not as damaged goods or an object of pity, but as herself. What do you see? She found herself asking. Ethan's smile was slow and genuine, transforming his weathered face into something almost beautiful. Competence, courage, kindness. His hands moved with increasing confidence. A woman who belongs exactly where she is. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the destroyed main street in shades of gold and crimson. Around them, the townspeople were beginning to clean up the debris, their voices carrying on the evening air, that Clara couldn't hear, but could feel in the vibrations through the wooden boards beneath her feet. For the first time since arriving in Willowbrook, Clara May Henderson felt like she might have found her place. Not as someone's reluctant charity case or desperate solution to a problem, but as herself, valued for what she could give, rather than judged for what she couldn't receive. Would you like to have dinner tomorrow? Ethan asked his question, carrying no expectation, only gentle hope. Clara looked at this man who spoke her language, who saw her worth, who offered companionship instead of mere transaction. For once in her life, she didn't hesitate. Yes, she signed, I would like that very much. Chapter 3. Dinner with Ethan Cross turned into a revelation that stretched far beyond food. He took her to his ranch, a sprawling operation nestled in a valley where the mountains cupped the sky like protective hands. The house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories of solid timber, with windows that caught the last light of day, but it was the silence that struck her most. Not the empty silence of isolation, but the peaceful quiet of a place where communication happened through more than words. I built this after my sister died, Ethan explained, as they sat on his front porch, their conversation flowing between sign language and spoken words as naturally as breathing. Emma was deaf too. Scarlet fever, same as you. She was everything bright in the world. Clara watched his hands move with the graceful precision of someone for whom sign language was poetry. How old was she? 16 when the consumption took her. She'd been teaching me new signs right up until the end, had a gift for making up her own when the standard ones weren't expressive enough. His smile held equal parts love and grief. She would have liked you, would have said you had speaking hands. Speaking hands. Her phrase for people whose signing felt alive. Most folks, when they learn sign language, they're just translating, moving their hands like they're writing words in the air. But some people like Emma, like you, their hands actually speak. There's emotion in every gesture, personality, in the way they shape their thoughts. Heat bloomed in Clara's cheeks. She'd never thought of her clumsy signing as anything approaching poetry, but the way Ethan watched her hands move suggested he saw something she'd never recognized in herself. They talked until the stars emerged bright and countless in the mountain sky. Ethan told her about his cattle operation, how he'd built it from nothing after losing his hearing in a blasting accident at a silver mine. Clara shared stories of her father's parish, the healing work she'd done alongside him, the garden she'd tended that had fed half the poor families in Millfield. Dr. Mitchell offered me a position, she said as they walked back toward town, the lantern he carried casting dancing shadows on the dusty road. Will you take it? Clara hesitated. 3 months ago, the answer would have been obvious. Take any work offered, be grateful for the chance to survive. But something had shifted during their evening together, some fundamental change in how she saw herself and her possibilities. I think I will, she said. For the first time in my life, someone wants to hire me because of my skills, not in spite of my limitations. Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her fully. In the lantern light, his expression was utterly serious. Clara, you need to understand something. What happened to you with Thomas Garrett, with all those other men, that's their failing, not yours. Any man too small-minded to see your worth doesn't deserve the privilege of your company. The conviction in his voice, the way he spoke, as if her value was an unquestionable fact rather than a hopeful possibility, made something tight in Clara's chest finally loosen. For 12 years, she had carried Aunt Cordelia's voice in her head, cataloging all the ways she fell short of what the world expected from a woman. But here was someone offering a different perspective, not that she was acceptable despite her deafness, but that she was valuable exactly as she was. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it in ways that went far deeper than gratitude for dinner or kind words. Working as Dr. Mitchell's assistant transformed Clara's place in Willowbrook, from that of an unwanted outsider to an essential member of the community. She learned to set bones, stitch wounds, and assist with the births. Her gentle touch and intuitive understanding of pain, perhaps born from her own experience of being misunderstood, made her particularly gifted with difficult patients. "You have a healing presence," Dr. Mitchell told her one morning as they treated Mrs. Chen's colicky baby. "People trust you instinctively. That's not something that can be taught." Clara's relationship with Ethan deepened alongside her growing confidence. He courted her with the patience of a man who understood that trust once broken required careful tending to bloom again. Their evenings together became the highlight of her days, sometimes dinner at his ranch, sometimes long walks through the mountain meadows, always filled with the kind of conversation that revealed the hidden chambers of the heart. "Tell me about your dreams," he sighed in one evening as they sat by the creek that bordered his property. "I used to dream of being invisible," she admitted, "of passing through the world without anyone noticing I was different." And now Clara considered the question, watching the water catch the last light of sunset. "Now I dream of being useful, of having a place where I belong, not because someone tolerates me, but because they need what I can give." "You already have that," Ethan replied, his hands moving with quiet certainty. "The question is whether you can see it." She was beginning to. In the grateful smiles of patience she'd helped heal, in Dr. Mitchell's increasing reliance on her judgment, in the way children in town had started waving to her on the street, not with the exaggerated gestures people often used around the deaf, but with the casual friendliness they showed to someone who belonged. But it was Ethan's steady presence that anchored her growing sense of self-worth. He never spoke louder or slower than necessary, never treated her deafness as something to be overcome or pitied. Instead, he seemed to find their shared silence a source of intimacy rather than limitation. "I'm falling in love with you," she signed one evening, the confession spilling from her hands before she could stop it. The words hung between them in the gathering dusk, and for a moment Clara felt the familiar flutter of panic, too much too soon, too presumptuous. But then Ethan's face broke into a smile that seemed to light the entire valley. "I've been in love with you since the first day," he replied. "I was just waiting for you to trust me enough to believe it." The first complication arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a letter bearing an Ohio postmark. Clara recognized Aunt Cordelia's spidery handwriting immediately, and her stomach clenched with familiar dread as she broke the seal. "Clara May, I have fallen ill and require your immediate return to care for me. You have had your foolish adventure long enough. A woman's place is with her family, not gallivanting about the wilderness playing at independence. I expect you on the next train. Your duty demands it, Aunt Cordelia." Dr. Mitchell found Clara sitting frozen at her desk in the clinic, the letter trembling in her hands. "Bad news from home. My aunt is ill," Clara managed. "She wants me to return to Ohio to care for her." "Wants or needs, doctor?" Mitchell's tone was sharp, with the instincts of someone who'd spent years distinguishing between actual medical emergencies and emotional manipulation. Clara read the letter again, looking for details about Cordelia's condition. The older woman had been characteristically vague. "Fallen ill" could mean anything from a serious ailment to a convenient case of loneliness now that Clara's unpaid labor was no longer available. "I don't know," she admitted. "She raised me after my parents died. I owe her—" "You owe her gratitude for keeping you from starvation," Dr. Mitchell interrupted. "You don't owe her your entire future. What does your heart tell you?" Clara's heart told her that Colorado had become home in ways Ohio never had, that she'd found work that mattered, people who valued her, a man who loved her exactly as she was. But 12 years of being told she was a burden, that her needs came last, that gratitude required sacrifice, those voices were hard to silence. That evening she showed the letter to Ethan. His jaw tightened as he read, and when he looked up, his eyes held a protective fury that both thrilled and terrified her. "She's manipulating you," he signed. "She's family. She took me in when no one else would and held it over your head ever since. Ethan's hands moved with sharp precision. Clara loved this woman, convinced you that you were worthless enough to ship to strangers. Now that you've built a life without her, suddenly, she needs you back. The logic was undeniable, but guilt was a powerful opponent to reason. What if she truly is ill? What if she dies alone because I chose my own happiness over duty? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through frustration, understanding, and finally a kind of resigned protectiveness. What would convince you to stay? I don't know. Clara signed and hated herself for the honesty. Then we'll find out together, he replied. Send a telegram asking for details about her condition. If she's truly ill, we'll figure out how to help her without destroying what you've built here. If she's not, his hands paused, then continued with gentle firmness, then you'll have to choose between the life she wants for you and the life you want for yourself. The telegram response came 3 days later, and it was vintage Cordelia. Details unnecessary, duty is duty, come at once or live with the consequences. No mention of symptoms, no doctor's name, no specific ailment, just the familiar demand for unquestioning obedience that had shaped Clara's first 24 years. For the first time, she found herself seeing her aunt's words through different eyes, not as the pronouncements of someone who knew best, but as the manipulations of someone afraid of losing control. She's not dying. Clara signed to Ethan, relief and anger warring in her chest. She just wants me back under her thumb. What will you do? I'm going to write her a letter, Clara decided. And for the first time in my life, I'm going to tell her exactly what I think. The letter took her 3 drafts to get right. Dear Aunt Cordelia, I am sorry to hear you are unwell, though your refusal to provide any medical details makes it difficult to assess the seriousness of your condition. I have built a life in Colorado that brings me satisfaction and purpose. I work as a medical assistant, have a place in the community, and have found someone who values me as I am. I will not be returning to Ohio. If you are truly ill, please send details, and I will arrange for appropriate care. If you are lonely, I suggest you examine why the young woman you once had in your house chose to travel 2,000 miles to escape you. Respectfully, Clara May Henderson. It was the first time she'd ever stood up to Cordelia, the first time she'd put her own needs before someone else's demands. The act of sealing the envelope felt like shedding a skin she'd outgrown years ago. The second complication arrived with the autumn drought. By October, the streams were running low, and the grass had turned brown and brittle. Cattle clustered around the few remaining water sources, and tensions in town ran as high as the temperature. Clara found herself at the center of efforts to conserve what water remained. Her father's agricultural knowledge, gleaned from years of counseling farming families, proved invaluable in developing rationing systems and identifying new sources. The old settlers used to say there was a spring up in Devil's Canyon. She told the emergency town meeting, her voice steady despite speaking to a room full of people who months ago had viewed her as an unwanted charity case. My father kept records of everything the parishioners told him about the land. If we could find it, that's a 2-day ride into rough country, Mayor Jameson protested. And you're talking about chasing stories from 20 years ago. Stories kept my father's congregation fed during the lean years, Claire replied firmly. Sometimes old wisdom is the only wisdom that matters. Ethan volunteered immediately to lead the expedition, and Clara insisted on going with him. I know what to look for, she argued when Dr. Mitchell protested. My father taught me to read the land to spot the signs of underground water. The journey into Devil's Canyon tested every skill Clara had learned about survival and every ounce of courage she'd built since arriving in Colorado. The terrain was harsh, the weather unpredictable, and more than once she wondered if they were chasing fool's hope into the wilderness. But on the second day, as they crested a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, Clara spotted it, the telltale green of water-loving plants in a landscape otherwise brown with drought. The spring was exactly where the old-timers had said it would be, bubbling clear and cold from a crack in the canyon wall. You found it, Ethan signed in wonder and pride shining in his eyes. We found it, she corrected, but the joy of discovery, of being right, of contributing something vital to her community's survival, filled her with a sense of accomplishment she'd never experienced before. The water from Devil's Canyon Springs saved Willowbrook's cattle and earned Clara a respect that had nothing to do with pity or charity. She was no longer the deaf mail-order bride who'd been rejected and stayed out of desperation. She was Clara Henderson, the woman who'd helped save the town. The third complication came in the form of fire. It started as a distant glow on the horizon somewhere up in the timber country north of town. Clara first noticed it from the clinic window, an orange smudge against the evening sky that hadn't been there an hour before. By morning, the smell of smoke had reached Willowbrook, and by noon the wind had shifted, pushing the flames directly toward the town. "Everyone who can ride needs to get up there," Sheriff Morrison announced from the steps of the town hall. "We'll need every able-bodied person to cut fire breaks and wet down the buildings." Clara looked around at the organized chaos of the evacuation effort. Families were loading wagons with their most precious possessions, children crying as they were separated from pets and toys, elderly residents struggling to pack a lifetime into what they could carry. "I'm going with the firefighting crew," she signed to Ethan. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. And it's too dangerous for you, too. But you're going." Her hands moved with sharp determination. "I can read the wind patterns. I can spot new ignition points before anyone else notices them." "You know I can." Ethan's face went through a dozen emotions: fear, protectiveness, frustration, and finally reluctant pride. "We stay together, no heroics," agreed. The fire was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. Even without hearing, she could feel its presence, the heat that pressed against her face like a physical weight, the way the wind carried ash and embers that stung her eyes and throat, the vibration through the ground as burning trivia crashed down in the distance. But her disability for once proved to be an advantage. While others were distracted by the roar of flames and the shouts of men calling instructions, Clara could focus entirely on visual cues, the color of smoke that indicated which way the wind was pushing the fire, the subtle changes in light that revealed new hotspots, the behavior of animals fleeing the flames that showed which escape routes were still clear. There she signed to Ethan, pointing toward a stand of trees that were just beginning to smolder. "It's jumping the fire break." He followed her gaze, saw what she'd spotted, and immediately began organizing a crew to attack the new ignition point before it could establish itself. Time after time, throughout the long night, Clara's observations helped the firefighters stay ahead of the flames' advance. By dawn, the fire had been contained, though not before consuming several thousand acres of forest and coming within 50 yards of the town's outlying buildings. Clara sat on a hay bale outside the clinic, her face streaked with soot and her hands blistered from wielding a shovel, watching the sun rise through the smoke-hazed air. "You saved us," Ethan sighed, collapsing beside her with exhaustion written in every line of his body. "We all did." "No." His hands moved with careful emphasis. "Your eyes, your ability to see what others missed that made the difference. Without you, we would have lost the whole town." Around them, the people of Willowbrook were beginning to return to their homes, their relief and gratitude evident in every gesture. More than one person stopped to thank Clara personally, their words and expressions making it clear that she was no longer an outsider who'd earned temporary acceptance. She was one of them, a full member of the community whose contributions had proved essential. For a woman who'd spent her entire adult life being told she was a burden, the transformation felt nothing short of miraculous. "I love you, Ethan," signed his soot-stained hands, framing her face with infinite tenderness. "I love you too," she replied, and for the first time in her life, she felt worthy of being loved in return. The fire had burned away more than just timber and grass. It had burned away the last of Clara's doubts about her place in the world, leaving behind something stronger and surer than she'd ever dared to hope for. She was home, she was useful, she was loved, and she was finally ready to claim the life she deserved. Chapter 4. Aunt Cordelia arrived on the morning train like a storm cloud dressed in black silk. Clara saw her first from the clinic window, a severe figure stepping onto the platform with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to having the world bend to her will. Even from a distance, Cordelia's disapproval was visible in every sharp angle of her body, every precise movement of her gloved hands as she surveyed Willowbrook with obvious disdain. "That's her, isn't it?" Dr. Mitchell asked, following Clara's gaze. "Your aunt." Clara nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. She thought herself prepared for this confrontation, had rehearsed a dozen speeches about independence and self-determination. But seeing Cordelia in the flesh brought back every childhood memory of being made to feel small, defective, grateful for crumbs of tolerance. "She's here," Claire signed to Ethan when he arrived at the clinic an hour later, his face grim with protective concern. I know, half the town's talking about the woman in black asking pointed questions about your situation. Miss Clara May Henderson. Cordelia's voice cut through the clinic like a blade as she swept through the door without knocking. We need to speak. Privately. The years had not been kind to Cordelia. Her face was more pinched than Clara remembered, her gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of dissatisfaction. But her eyes held the same cold authority that had shaped Clara's childhood, the absolute certainty that her judgment was both final and correct. Aunt Cordelia, Clara said carefully, rising from her desk, I didn't expect you to come all this way. Clearly. Cordelia's gaze swept the clinic with obvious distaste, taking in the medical supplies, the examination table, the certificates on the wall that proclaimed Dr. Mitchell's credentials. Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, you always did have a talent for making yourself indispensable to people's baser needs. The casual cruelty of the comment hit Clara like a physical blow. But before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward. His presence seemed to fill the small space, protective and solid and utterly unmovable. Mrs. he said, his voice carrying the careful courtesy that barely concealed steel. Morrison, Mrs. Cordelia Morrison, and you are A.M. Ethan Cross, Clara's intended husband. The words sent a thrill through Clara's chest, even as Cordelia's face darkened with obvious displeasure. They hadn't officially discussed marriage yet, but hearing Ethan claim her so publicly, so proudly, made something fierce and joyful unfurl in her heart. Intended husband. Cordelia repeated, her tone suggesting she'd tasted something sour. How convenient. Tell me, Mr. Cross, are you aware of the full extent of my niece's limitations? I'm aware of her extraordinary strengths, Ethan replied evenly, which is more than I can say for anyone in Ohio. Cordelia's lips pursed into a thin line. Clara May, we will speak alone, now. Clara felt the familiar pull of old habits, the ingrained response to Cordelia's authority that had shaped her first 24 years. But she also felt Ethan's steady presence beside her, Dr. Mitchell's respectful confidence, the memory of an entire town grateful for her contributions. When she spoke, her voice was steady. Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Ethan. Very well. Cordelia's composure cracked slightly, revealing the anger beneath her controlled facade. Since you've chosen to air your business publicly, let me be equally direct. This charade has gone on long enough. You will return to Ohio with me on tomorrow's train. No, Clara said simply. I beg your pardon. I said no, I'm not returning to Ohio. I have a life here, work that matters, people who, what value you? Cordelia's laugh was sharp and bitter. Clara May, you are a deaf spinster with no family connections, no dowry, and no prospects beyond whatever charity these frontier people have extended you. Do you honestly believe this man, she gestured dismissively at Ethan, would choose you if he had any other options? The words struck deep, hitting every insecurity Clara had carried since losing her hearing. For a moment, she felt 12 years old again, standing in her aunt's parlor, while being told that gratitude was the highest emotion she should dare to aspire to. But then she looked at Ethan's face and saw not pity or obligation, but a fury so pure it took her breath away. His hands moved in sharp, angry signs. How dare she speak to you that way? Actually, Ethan said aloud, his voice deadly quiet. I would choose Clara if I had 1,000 options. I would choose her if she were the last woman on earth, or if she were one among millions. I choose her every day because she is brave, intelligent, compassionate, and strong enough to build a life worth living, despite people like you trying to convince her she doesn't deserve one. Cordelia's face flushed with anger. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Ethan stepped closer to Clara, his hand finding hers with easy familiarity. I understand that you convinced a remarkable woman she was worthless, so you could keep her as unpaid labor. I understand that when she finally escaped and built something beautiful for herself, you followed her here to destroy it. What I don't understand is how anyone could look at Clara and see anything other than a gift. She is damaged. She is perfect. Ethan's voice rang with absolute conviction. Every scar, every struggle, every moment of pain that brought her to this place, it's all part of what makes her the woman I love. The woman this town needs. The woman who saved us from drought and fire, and proved that sometimes what the world calls broken is actually what makes us whole. Clara felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of either rather than shame. Hearing someone defend her so fiercely, claim her so completely, see her so clearly, it was like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime in shadow. "You're making a mistake," Cordelia said, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. She sounded older, suddenly more fragile, like a woman facing the realization that her weapons no longer had power. "The only mistake," Clara said quietly, "was believing for so long that I was lucky to receive scraps of affection instead of demanding the full feast I deserved." She looked directly at her aunt, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, not as an authority figure whose approval she needed, but as a bitter woman whose fear of being alone had driven her to cruelty. "I forgive you for the things you said to me when I was too young to know better. But I won't let you poison my future with the same lies." Cordelia stood frozen for a long moment, her carefully constructed composure finally crumbling. Without another word, she turned and swept from the clinic, her black skirts rustling with wounded dignity. Clara sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. She'd stood up to Cordelia, completely claimed her own worth publicly, and heard the man she loved declare her perfect in front of the woman who'd spent years convincing her she was fundamentally flawed. "Are you all right?" Ethan signed, kneeling beside her chair. "I think," Clara replied slowly, "I'm better than all right. I think I'm finally free." Outside, a commotion arose in the street. Through the clinic window, Clara could see smoke rising from the direction of the school. Not the heavy black smoke of a dangerous fire, but the gray wisps that suggested something was burning that shouldn't be. They rushed outside to find young Tommy O'Brien standing in the schoolyard, tears streaming down his face as he watched a pile of books and papers smolder in the dirt. Clara recognized him immediately, the 8-year-old deaf boy whose mother cleaned houses for the wealthier families in town. "What happened?" Clara sighed, dropping to her knees beside the child. "The teacher said my books were making the other children nervous." Tommy replied, his small hands moving with the jerky uncertainty of someone still learning to express complex emotions in sign language. "She said I should learn at home so I don't distract the hearing children." Rage flooded through Clara. Not the cold, familiar ache of being excluded, but the hot fury of seeing injustice inflicted on someone she could protect. She looked at the burned books, the scattered papers as a defeated slump of Tommy's small shoulders, and felt something crystallize inside her chest. "You deserve to learn," she signed fiercely. "You deserve to be in that classroom with every other child in this town." "But I'm different. Different is not less." Clara interrupted, her hands moving with passionate conviction. "Different is not wrong. Different is not something to hide or apologize for." As she spoke, she realized she was talking to herself as much as to Tommy, speaking the words she'd needed to hear at 8, at 12, at 24. Words that might have changed everything if someone had been brave enough to say them. "I'm going to start a school," she signed the decision, forming as she spoke it. "A real school where children like us can learn everything we're capable of learning. Where being deaf is just one fact about us, not the most important fact." Tommy's eyes widened with hope. "Really? Really?" Clara stood, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had money saved from her work with Dr. Mitchell. Ethan's ranch had outbuildings that could be converted, and most importantly, she had the respect of a community that had seen her worth proven in crisis after crisis. "What can I do to help?" Ethan signed, and Clara's heart swelled with love for this man who never asked if her dreams were practical or proper, only how he could support them. "Help me change the world," she replied, one child at a time. As they walked home together, Tommy skipping between them with renewed excitement, Clara felt the last pieces of her transformation settling into place. She was no longer the frightened woman who'd stepped off the train 6 months ago, hoping to disappear into someone else's life. She was Clara Henderson, healer teacher woman, worthy of love, and she was finally ready to live the life she'd always been meant to claim. Chapter 5. The wedding took place on the first day of spring in the meadow, where Ethan had first told Clara she had speaking hands. Dart Mitchell served as matron of honor, Tommy carried the rings with solemn pride, and half of Willowbrook attended to witness the union of the deaf rancher and the woman who'd helped save their town. Clara wore her mother's dress altered to fit her smaller frame, with wildflowers in her hair and her father's Bible in her hands. As she walked toward Ethan across the grass, still soft with melted snow, She thought of all the miles she'd traveled to reach this moment, not just the physical distance from Ohio to Colorado, but the emotional journey from shame to pride, from isolation to belonging, from believing she was broken to knowing she was whole. "You're beautiful," Ethan signed it as she reached him, his eyes bright with tears of joy. "I feel beautiful," she replied, and meant it completely. Pastor Williams had learned enough sign language to include both spoken vows and signed promises in the ceremony. When he asked Ethan to state his intentions, the rancher's hands moved with the grace of poetry. "I promise to love you, not despite your differences, but because of them. I promise to see you clearly speak your language and build a life where you never have to pretend to be anything other than exactly who you are." Clara's response came from the deepest truth of her heart. "I promise to love you with all the courage you've helped me find. I promise to be your partner in everything. Your joy, your sorrow, your dreams, and your daily bread." When they kissed to seal their union, the assembled crowd erupted in applause that Clara felt through the ground beneath her feet, a vibration of celebration that resonated in her bones. The reception lasted until sunset, filled with dancing Clara could follow by watching the musicians' movements and food that celebrated both her Ohio roots and her Colorado home. As the evening wound down, she found herself standing with Ethan at the edge of the meadow, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Any regrets?" he asked, his arms solid and warm around her waist. Clara thought of Thomas Garrett, who'd seen her deafness as a defect, of Aunt Cordelia, who'd left town on the morning train without saying goodbye, her final attempt at control having failed so completely. Of all the years she'd spent believing she was lucky to receive any affection at all. "Only that it took me so long to find you," she replied. "We found each other exactly when we were supposed to," Ethan said. "Not a moment before, not a moment after." 3 months later, the Henderson School for Deaf Children opened in the converted barn on Ethan's ranch. Clara's first class consisted of Tommy O'Brien and two other deaf children whose families had traveled from as far as Denver to enroll them. By the end of the first year, she had 8 students and a waiting list of families desperate to give their children what the hearing world had denied them, a real education that honored their intelligence, rather than dismissing their potential. Dr. Mitchell continued to rely on Clara's assistance for the more complex cases, and the two women had become true partners in bringing modern medical care to Willowbrook. Clara's ability to communicate with deaf patients had proven so valuable that other doctors in the territory began referring cases to their practice. On quiet evenings, Clara and Ethan would sit on their porch and plan the future they were building together. The school would expand, perhaps eventually becoming a boarding institution that could serve children from across the West. They talked of hiring other deaf teachers, of developing new methods for education, of proving to the world that what others saw as limitations could become extraordinary strengths. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if Thomas Garrett hadn't rejected you?" Ethan asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. Clara considered the question seriously. She might have been a rancher's wife, anonymous and grateful, spending her days in quiet domesticity while her potential withered unused. She would never have worked with Dr. Mitchell, never have discovered her gift for healing, never have started the school that was already changing young lives, never have found the fierce joy of being loved for exactly who she was rather than tolerated despite her differences. "I would have been safe," she signed finally, "but I never would have been happy." And now Clara looked at her husband, this man who spoke her language, shared her silence, and saw her dreams as clearly as she did. She thought of her students, bright and eager and unashamed of their deafness, because she'd taught them it was just one thread in the tapestry of who they were. She thought of the town that had welcomed her not as charity case, but as an essential member of their community. "Now I'm both," she replied, "safe and happy and useful and loved." As the stars emerged overhead, Clara May Cross no longer. Henderson, no longer defined by loss or limitation, felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived fully. The scars were still there, visible on her throat when she untied her epaulette, invisible, but permanent in her heart, where grief for her lost brother and parents would always live. But she'd learned that scars weren't signs of weakness. They were proof of survival, evidence of strength, marks of beauty earned through struggle and growth. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, not the desperate shriek of fear she'd heard when first arriving in Willowbrook, but a song of possibility, of journeys undertaken and destinations reached. Somewhere another woman might be sitting in a railroad car traveling toward an uncertain future, carrying her own bundle of fears and hope. Clara whispered a prayer for that unknown traveler, that she too might find the courage to claim the life she deserved. That she too might discover that what the world called broken could actually be the source of her greatest strength. The mountains stood silent and eternal around them, and Clara Cross was home.